What is military doctrine? It's a word that militaries use a lot, but it's not always clear what it means. And sometimes it seems that the militaries themselves don't know what it means either. Hello everyone. In this video, I want to focus on military doctrine. It's a sometimes confusing term, and it can be difficult to distinguish from other types of documents like strategies or operational procedures, things like that. So what is a doctrine? What does it consist of, and how do militaries use it? One way to go about it is, of course, to see how doctrine defines itself. There are several so-called capstone documents that try to define what a doctrine is. For example, the American JP1 says that the purpose of joint doctrine is to enhance the operational effectiveness of joint forces by providing fundamental principles that guide the employment of U.S. military forces toward a common objective. And NATO has a somewhat similar definition. AJP1, Allied Joint Doctrine, says that doctrine is fundamental principles by which military forces guide their actions in support of objectives. It's authoritative, but requires judgment in application. So according to these capstone documents, a doctrine is sort of a series of guiding principles for military forces. However, there are some problems with these definitions. First, it's not evident that doctrine is particularly good at describing principles. The texts tend to be written in a quite simplistic way, so it's easy to read, but it leaves out many of the nuances. And doctrine typically also doesn't have any references, so the reader doesn't know where those principles come from. Like, apparently the principles come from best practices and contemporary insights, but that's not particularly helpful if the reader wants to learn more. And AJP1 even says that the reader is supposed to exercise judgment in the application of doctrine. But how are you supposed to do that if you don't know what the relevant discussions are? And then there is the second problem with these definitions. And it is that there are many documents that call themselves doctrines, but they don't seem to fit the definition. For example, there is a document like the Netherlands Maritime Military Doctrine, which basically is an entire 370 pages textbook on maritime warfare. Or there is Russia's military doctrine, which basically is a strategic policy paper. And then there are documents that don't actually want to be doctrines, but somehow get that label anyways. So perhaps we should look beyond doctrine if we want to know what a doctrine is. And I think one of the best takes comes from Harald Heubach. He's a Norwegian Air Force officer, and he has a PhD in philosophy, and he has written a lot about doctrine. And I think, frankly, his description of doctrine is a lot more useful than the one we find in these so-called capstone documents. And in this video, I will mostly use Harald Heubach's 2016 article, The Anatomy of Doctrine and Ways to Keep It Fit. I think that's the best one. Heubach begins this article with the observation that there seem to be two competing schools of thought on the question of doctrine. One says that doctrine is important for military organizations because otherwise their actions will be uncoordinated. Military units can't just go out into the field and be spontaneous. So the proponents of this school of thought, they recognize that there is bad doctrine out there, but they believe that this should be fixed by making better doctrine. And then there is the other school of thought that basically disregards doctrine altogether. Like, according to them, the concept of doctrine is obsolete because the world changes so rapidly that these documents can never keep up anyways. So whenever we get around to actually writing down those so-called best practices, then they're already antiquated. Heubach is mostly in the first school of thought. He believes that doctrine is important. He also recognizes that there is a lot of bad doctrine out there, but he believes that we should fix that by making better doctrine. But at the same time, he also believes that many of the assumptions that we have about doctrine are wrong. So if we want to make better doctrine, then we need to think more carefully about what it is and how it can be useful. So Heubach says that military doctrine can be defined as institutionalized beliefs about what works in war and military operations. And then he says that good doctrine has three essential elements, and they are theory, culture, and authority. And by theory, Heubach means that a doctrine has to express some ideas about what works and what doesn't work, and the doctrine also has to explain why it works. So it's not enough to just give some instructions. And here he actually addresses the point I made in the beginning of the video, where I complained that a lot of the current doctrine is not very good at explaining the principles that supposedly are the subject of the document. So the second element that Heubach mentions is culture. And here he refers to the fact that doctrine has to be relevant to the people who are supposed to use it. If the doctrine deals with a problem that nobody cares about, or if it deals with it in a way that the users find irrelevant, then nobody's going to use the doctrine, and then it will just be forgotten and it will be put in a bookshelf and collects dust. And then finally, doctrine has to contain authority. It matters who signed the paper. And the fact that the doctrine is written by the military institution itself, that gives it value. Sometimes it may be that a textbook objectively has better ideas or better theories than the doctrine, but it doesn't have the same authority. So to create a common language and a common frame of reference that everyone in the military organization knows, the doctrine is important. It is important because it has authority. So those are the three elements of doctrine: theory, culture, and authority. And then Heubach also points to different use cases. He points to three. First, he says that doctrine can be a tool of command. Here, doctrine basically says what the armed forces should do in a given situation. It provides instructions. Second, doctrine can be a tool of education. It can be used in the education of soldiers who need to learn how to think about warfare. And finally, doctrine can also be a tool of change. So leaders can use doctrine to set a new direction. And just the process of writing the new doctrine is actually a great learning opportunity for the organization. Heubach also points to some interesting cultural differences in how countries use doctrine. And according to him, it actually depends much on geography. So countries that traditionally have been engaged in expeditionary warfare, they wouldn't know the exact geography where they would be fighting. So in these countries, they tend to see doctrine mostly as a tool of education, because really it's mostly about learning some principles and how to apply those principles in new situations that are unpredictable. So this is, for example, the case in the United States or in the United Kingdom, that they see doctrine mostly as a tool of education. But in other countries with a more, can we say, continental geography, doctrine has traditionally been seen more as a tool of command. And that's because these countries, we can take Germany, for example, have more or less faced the same enemies and fought the same wars over and over again throughout history. So because the geography didn't change, the doctrine could be much more detailed and contain more precise instructions as to exactly what should be done. So we have different ideas about what the purpose of doctrine is and what it's supposed to achieve. And I think it's logical that this is also visible in the ways we write doctrine. So obviously, if you want to use doctrine as a tool of education or as a tool of change, then you will put more emphasis on explaining the theory in your doctrine. But if it's mostly a tool of command, then you'll maybe rather want your doctrine to be very short, or maybe even to reduce it to a flowchart. And that, of course, also leads to the question of whether this very brief way of writing doctrine is good enough for doctrine for the modern battle space. And I tend to believe that the answer is probably not. So I think we need to improve the quality of doctrine by making it more clear where the principles come from. So it's not enough that we just claim that they come from best practices or something else that doesn't give the reader a deeper understanding of the reasoning behind it. All right, I guess I'm starting to ramble here, so it's probably time to wrap it up. I hope you found it useful, and I'll see you again next time.